The desert stretched wide and endless beneath the rising sun, painted in shades of amber and dust. A dry wind carried the scent of mesquite and sagebrush, whispering through the canyons like an old secret no one dared to speak aloud. Somewhere in that silence, a single horse moved along the narrow trail, its hooves sinking softly into the sand. The woman riding it sat straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she were running from something, or perhaps toward something she could not name. Behind her rode the Apache, quiet as a shadow. His dark eyes scanned the landscape, alert to every sound, every shift in the air. He had followed her for 3 days, through canyons carved by time, and across plains that shimmered with heat. I had said little, offering no reason for her flight, no explanation for the sorrow that clung to her like a ghost. He had not asked. Some things, he knew, revealed themselves when the land was ready to speak. They came upon a ridge where the valley below opened wide, dotted with cacti and dry brush. The woman stopped her horse and turned slightly, her face half hidden by the brim of her hat. "Don't look back," she said, her voice low, trembling in the wind. "It's better that way." The Apache said nothing, but he had already seen the truth she tried to hide. It was in the way her hand lingered near the worn satchel tied to her saddle, in the tightness of her shoulders, in the silence that followed her every word. Whatever she was leaving behind, it wasn't gone, it was chasing her. The trail below them wound toward a distant range, where the mountains rose blue and hazy in the afternoon light. The woman urged her horse forward again, the reins shaking slightly in her grasp. She looked small against the vast desert, yet there was a strength in her that could not be denied. She rode as if the land itself demanded she keep going, as if stopping meant surrendering to something worse than death. By noon, the sun burned high and cruel. The Apache dismounted near a dry creek bed, kneeling to touch the earth. The ground was cracked, the soil hot beneath his fingers. He stood slowly, scanning the tracks that led west. There were others behind them, fresh prints, more than one horse. He brushed the dust from his hands and walked to her side. "You're being followed," he said quietly. She stiffened, but didn't turn. "I know," she murmured. "They've been behind me since San Isidro." The Apache's brow furrowed. "Why?" She hesitated, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Because of what I took, because of what I left." He waited, but she said no more. Her voice carried a weight that did not invite questions. Instead, he mounted his horse again and rode beside her, matching her pace. The silence between them grew heavy, filled only by the rhythm of hooves and the distant call of a hawk. As the day stretched on, the desert began to change. The land grew rockier, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain far off to the east. The Apache watched her from the corner of his eye. She rode with purpose, but her face was pale, her lips dry. There was exhaustion in her movements, the kind that came not just from the body, but from the heart. When they stopped near dusk, the sky was streaked with gold and violet. She dismounted slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The Apache built a small fire, careful to keep the smoke low. She sat across from him, the flames casting soft light across her face. For the first time he saw the faint scar near her temple, the mark of something that had nearly broken her once. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, her voice breaking the quiet. He looked into the fire, his expression calm. "Because you asked," he said simply. She gave a bitter smile. "I didn't ask. You just followed." He met her eyes then. Not everything must be spoken. For a moment they sat in silence, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She hesitated, then set it gently beside her. "If anything happens to me," she said softly, "promise me you'll take this to the mission in Tucson." The Apache looked at the bundle, then back at her. "What is it?" Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "Something worth dying for." He nodded once, understanding that some truths were better carried in silence. The night deepened, stars spreading like scattered silver across the black sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry echoing through the canyons. The woman shifted closer to the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. The Apache watched her, noting how her gaze lingered on the darkness beyond the flames, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from it. When the wind rose, carrying sand and whispers through the camp, he spoke quietly. "They will come before dawn." She didn't ask how he knew. She only nodded and looked into the fire again. her expression caught between fear and determination. "Then we ride before first light." The Apache inclined his head. "And after that?" Her eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "We keep riding. We don't look back." But he knew better. He had seen the way she glanced over her shoulder when she thought he wasn't watching. The ghosts she carried weren't behind her, they were inside her, and no distance would ever be far enough. When dawn came, pale and cold, the two riders set out once more. The horizon was a blur of gold and gray, the air thick with tension. They moved fast, cutting across the open plain toward the distant mountains. The Apache stayed close, scanning the ridges for movement. By mid-morning, the sound of horses reached them. The woman tensed, her knuckles white around the reins. "They're close," she said. The Apache nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We can reach the old mining town before sundown. There are caves there, safe for the night." She turned toward him then, her face pale beneath the brim of her hat. "Safe," she whispered, as if testing the word. "I don't think anywhere is safe anymore." He didn't answer. Instead, he urged his horse faster, leading her toward the shadow of the distant cliffs. The desert wind rose around them, scattering dust and fragments of old memories. The woman's hat nearly flew from her head, and for a moment she laughed a sharp, unexpected sound that broke the weight of fear. But just as quickly, her laughter faded. Behind them, the faint echo of riders grew louder. The Apache glanced back once, his face set like stone. Then he turned to her. "Keep going. Don't stop for anything." She met his gaze, her voice trembling. "And if I fall, then I'll find you," he said. Something flickered in her eyes, trust. Perhaps her hope, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She looked ahead once more, toward the jagged line of mountains rising from the sand, and urged her horse forward. The Apache followed close behind, both of them riding into a storm of dust and sun and fate. The sky darkened as thunder rolled across the distant peaks. The woman's hair whipped free in the wind, her silhouette fierce against the fading light. She didn't speak again, but her thoughts ran wild of the past she couldn't erase, of the promise she couldn't keep, and of the man riding behind her who seemed to see through every wall she tried to build. As lightning split the sky, the first drops of rain fell, hissing against the hot sand. The Apache looked ahead, seeing the entrance to the canyon not far now. He turned to call out to her, but she was no longer beside him. Her horse was riderless, galloping ahead. The bundle she had carried was gone, and in the echoing silence that followed, he heard only her last words on the wind, soft, distant, and filled with sorrow. "Don't look back." The rain came down hard, washing the dust from the air and leaving the desert smelling of wet earth and smoke. The Apache dismounted, scanning the open plain for any sign of her. The storm had swallowed her tracks, and the wind carried only the sound of thunder rolling across the distant cliffs. For a moment he stood there, the rain dripping from his hair, his breath steady despite the chill. Then he moved, following the direction her horse had taken, eyes sharp, instincts guiding him more than sight. He found the horse near a dry arroyo, its reins tangled in a patch of thorny brush. The saddle was soaked, the leather dark with rain, and the bundle she had carried was gone. He knelt, pressing a hand against the ground. The soil was soft, and faint impressions marked where she had fallen or jumped off. There were more tracks boots, at least 2 sets, moving toward the canyon. He felt a quiet tension coil inside him. She hadn't disappeared by choice. As he followed the tracks, the storm began to fade, leaving a low mist hanging over the land. The canyon walls rose around him, tall and jagged, their red faces streaked dark from the rain. Somewhere within that maze of stone, the truth waited. He moved carefully, one hand resting on the worn handle of his knife, his other brushing against the rock to steady his path. Every few steps, he paused to listen. The air carried faint sounds, voices low and tense, echoing off the canyon walls. He crouched near a cluster of rocks and looked ahead. 3 riders had dismounted by a narrow ledge, their horses tethered to a dead tree. One of them stood close to the woman, gripping her arm while the others searched through the satchel she had dropped. She wasn't struggling, but her face was pale, her clothes soaked through. She met the Apache's gaze for a brief second across the distance, just enough for him to know she had seen him, enough to know she didn't want him to act yet. The man holding her spoke, his voice rough. You ran far for nothing. You knew we'd come. Her voice was steady, though soft. I wasn't running. I was keeping something safe. He laughed, the sound sharp against the stone. Safe? You think there's safety left in this country? You should have stayed quiet and done as you were told. The Apache shifted slightly, watching as the man reached for the bundle. The cloth was soaked, but its shape still held firm, small, square, and heavy. Whatever was inside wasn't gold, but it was worth dying for. That much was clear. Before the man could open it, a shot cracked through the canyon. The bullet hit the rock beside him, sending a spray of stone chips into the air. The riders spun toward the sound, but the Apache had already vanished into the mist. Panic broke their focus. In the confusion, the woman twisted free, kicking the nearest man and grabbing the satchel. She ran toward the narrow passage that led deeper into the canyon, her breath loud in the sudden silence. The Apache met her halfway, his hand steadying her as she stumbled. "Come," he said simply. They moved quickly, weaving through narrow gaps and climbing over slick stones. Behind them, the shouts grew fainter until the wind swallowed them. When they finally stopped, the storm had moved west, and the sun began breaking through the clouds. She leaned against the rock, gasping for breath. "You shouldn't have come," she said quietly. He studied her face, then glanced at the satchel she held tight against her chest. "You're not meant to face them alone." Her eyes flickered with something between gratitude and fear. "You don't understand what's in here," she said, clutching the bundle closer. "If they find it, more people will die." He looked out toward the valley below. "Then we make sure they don't." For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy with questions neither dared to ask. Finally, she said, "You want to know why they're chasing me?" He nodded once. She unwrapped the cloth just enough to reveal a worn leather book, its cover marked with symbols he didn't recognize. The edges of the pages were frayed, and some were stained dark with age. "This belonged to a man they killed," she said softly. "A man who found something he wasn't supposed to." "What did he find?" She hesitated, then closed the book again. Proof of the kind of deal that ruins whole towns. They were trading land, selling promises that never belonged to them. "This book tells where the bodies are buried, figuratively and otherwise." The Apache's expression hardened. He had seen men like that before, traitors and soldiers, who spoke of justice but dealt only in greed. "You took it from them." "Yes, and they'll burn every acre of this land to get it back." He nodded slowly. "Then we ride where the wind hides us." Her hand trembled slightly as she tightened the wrap around the book. "You could still leave," she said. "You owe me nothing." He met her gaze. "I saw your pain before you spoke it. That makes it mine too." Her eyes softened, but the worry didn't fade. She looked out over the horizon, where the last streaks of sunlight touched the wet sand. "You talk like the earth listens to you," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "Sometimes it does." As night fell, they made camp at the mouth of the canyon. The fire burned low, the smoke curling upward into the dark sky. She sat with the book resting on her knees, tracing the edges of its cover. The Apache watched her from across the flames. There was something restless in her, something that didn't belong to the desert or the towns she'd fled. After a long silence, he asked, "The man they killed, was he close to you?" She looked into the fire. "He was someone I trusted, maybe the only one. He told me once that truth was heavier than gold and harder to carry. I didn't believe him until now." The Apache nodded slowly. "Truth breaks more hearts than lies ever could." She glanced up, studying his face in the firelight. "You talk like you've lost someone too." He looked toward the shadows beyond the fire. "I have." Neither spoke after that. The wind shifted, and the desert grew cold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, its voice lonely against the night. Before dawn, the woman stirred, waking to the faint sound of hooves. The Apache was already standing, bow in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness.
Ow.
He motioned for her to stay low. The faint outlines of riders appeared on the ridge above, their silhouettes black against the morning sky.
Ow.
They weren't far, maybe an hour behind. "They found us," she whispered. He nodded, calm as ever. "We move east. There's a river 2 days' ride from here. We'll find cover, she'll find cover." She packed the satchel quickly, her hands trembling just slightly. As they mounted their horses, she looked back once toward the ridge. "They won't stop," she said softly. Not until they have this. Then they'll follow us into their own graves, the Apache replied. The trail ahead wound through red rock and sparse brush, the land quiet except for the distant call of hawks. As the sun climbed higher, heat shimmered off the sand, and the woman's strength began to wane. The Apache noticed, offering her a flask of water. You ride hard for someone running from ghosts, he said gently. She gave a weary smile. It's not ghosts I'm afraid of. It's the living. By the second night, the land had changed, again rolling hills with patches of green. A dry riverbed cutting through them like a scar. They stopped there, letting the horses rest. She leaned against a rock, her eyes distant. Do you think there's still a place in this country where no one lies? She asked. He sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The earth doesn't lie. It remembers everything. The only lies come from those who walk on it. She nodded slowly, as if turning the words over in her mind. Then she looked at him. When this is over, what will you do? He thought for a moment. It's the same thing I've always done. Keep walking until the land feels right again. She smiled faintly. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It's the people who make it hard. The wind picked up again, rustling the dry grass around them. She tightened her hold on the satchel, as if afraid it might be taken from her, even now. He noticed and said softly, What's written in that book will change nothing if you die with it. She met his eyes. Then I have to live long enough to tell someone who'll listen. He nodded. Then I'll see that you do. The night deepened, the stars bright and clear above. The Apache didn't sleep. Listened to the rustle of the grass, to the shifting sand, to the faint sound of hooves somewhere far off. They were still coming, closer now, their shadows stretching longer each day. Before dawn broke, he woke her gently. Time to move. She opened her eyes, weary but determined. As she mounted her horse, she glanced at him and said quietly, If we make it through this, I'll tell you everything. He gave a small nod, his gaze fixed on the horizon ahead. And if we don't? She smiled sadly. Then I hope someone finds that book and keeps running. They rode on, two figures against the rising sun, the desert wind carrying their silence. Behind them, the dust rose once more, and the chase began again. The land stretched endless, waiting, holding secrets that neither of them was ready to face just yet. The sun rose heavy that morning, painting the land in colors that seemed almost unreal. The desert was quiet again, too quiet, as if holding its breath. The Apache rode ahead, scanning every ridge and dry wash for movement. The woman followed close behind, her horse tired but steady. She had barely spoken since dawn, her thoughts locked somewhere between fear and exhaustion. Every sound, the creak of saddle leather, the cry of a hawk, made her tense. They had been on the move for days, and the mountains now loomed closer, their slopes dark with pine. The Apache knew this land better than most. He had hunted here once, years before the soldiers came, and marked everything with fences and borders. To him, every ridge had a memory, every stream a name. But now the land was restless. The trails he once trusted felt strange, as if the earth itself was watching them. At midday, they stopped by a small spring hidden between the rocks. The woman drank deeply, then washed her face, letting the cold water ease the dust and weariness from her skin. The Apache filled his canteen and knelt beside her. We'll rest here a short while, he said. The horses need it. She nodded, glancing at the open sky. They're still behind us, aren't they? He looked toward the valley they had crossed earlier. The heat shimmered in the distance, bending the air, but he could see faint trails of dust moving like ghosts. Yes, he said quietly. 3 riders. Maybe 4. Her hand tightened around the satchel resting beside her. They won't stop, she said, her voice almost a whisper. No, he agreed. They won't. She looked at him then, her eyes sharp despite her fatigue. You could still leave, you know. Go your own way. You don't owe me your life. The Apache met her gaze calmly. My life is my own. Where I ride is my choice. She turned away, silent again, but there was a flicker of something respect, maybe even trust hidden in her expression. Later that afternoon, the sky began to darken. Storm clouds gathered over the peaks, heavy and gray. The Apache's instincts stirred uneasily. He didn't fear rain, but storms could change the land in ways that trapped even the surest riders. The emotion. The canyon was deep and cool, with high walls that muffled the wind. They found a small cave just large enough for the horses and a fire. As the first drops of rain fell, the woman sank down against the wall, breathing hard. The Apache gathered wood and struck a flame, its glow pushing back the darkness. For a while they listened to the rain beating against the stone. The sound was steady, like a drum, filling the silence between them. Then the woman spoke softly, as if afraid the storm might carry her words away. "I wasn't always running," she said. "Before all this, I lived in a town near the river. My husband worked with the railroad surveyors. He believed in progress, in building something that would last. But the men he worked for had other plans. They took land that wasn't theirs, forged papers, silenced anyone who questioned them. When he found out, they made sure he wouldn't speak again." The Apache said nothing, his eyes fixed on the fire. Went on, her voice trembling. "They called it an accident, but I saw what they did. I found his notes, maps, names, everything. That's what's in the book. Proof of how far their reach goes. I took it before they could destroy it. Now they're hunting me because I know too much." The Apache finally looked at her. "Do you think the mission in Tucson can help?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But there's a priest there who used to work with the railroad board. He's the only one who might believe me." The Apache nodded slowly. "Then we ride for Tucson." The fire crackled softly, casting shadows across the walls. She studied him, wondering how a man like him, quiet, deliberate, with eyes that saw deeper than words, had come to be her protector. "Why do you help me?" she asked again, more gently this time. He poked the fire with a stick, watching the sparks drift upward. "Once, a woman helped me when I had nothing left," he said. "She gave me water, even though her own children were thirsty. When I asked her why, she said, 'Because someone has to do what's right, even when it costs.' I've never forgotten that." The woman watched him in silence, understanding more than she could say. Outside, the rain eased to a soft drizzle. Night settled slowly over the land, wrapping it in quiet. But the peace didn't last long. Near midnight, the Apache woke suddenly. The horses were restless, snorting and shifting near the entrance. He stood, listening. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the canyons, low, careful, and close. He reached for his bow, motioning for the woman to stay silent. Shadows flickered near the cave mouth. Two men stepped into view, rifles slung over their shoulders. They moved like hunters who already knew their prey was cornered. The Apache waited, breath steady, his eyes fixed on the one in front. When the man took another step, the Apache moved silent and fast. The fight was brief but brutal. The first man went down before he could raise his weapon. The second fired once, the sound splitting the night, but the shot went wide. The Apache disarmed him with a single strike, sending his rifle clattering across the rocks. The man stumbled back, clutching his arm. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he hissed. "That woman's worth more than gold." The Apache's expression didn't change. "Then you'll die poor." The man turned to flee, but an arrow found its mark in the ground, just inches from his boots. He froze, hands shaking. "Tell the others to turn back," the Apache said. "Next time I won't miss." The man nodded frantically and ran, disappearing into the rain. The woman stepped out slowly, her face pale in the firelight. "You didn't have to let him go," she whispered. He met her eyes. Killing him would bring the others faster. Fear makes men slower. She nodded, though the tension in her shoulders didn't fade. The sound of the storm returned, filling the silence that followed. She turned back toward the fire, her mind racing. "They know where we are now," she said. "Yes," he answered. "We ride before sunrise." The rain stopped before dawn. They packed quickly and left the canyon, their horses moving fast through the wet sand. The sky cleared as they rode, revealing streaks of pale light along the horizon. The woman looked back once, her eyes narrowing. "Do you think they'll keep following?" The Apache didn't answer. He didn't need to. The trail behind them already carried the truth. By midday, the land began to rise again, hills covered in dry grass and twisted juniper. They came across an old settlement, little more than broken shacks and a windmill creaking in the breeze. The woman looked around, her expression uneasy. "What happened here?" "Railroad came through," the Apache said. "Took the water, the land, and left the rest to die." She dismounted, touching one of the weathered posts. The wood was cracked, the initials of a family long gone carved faintly into it. "It feels wrong," she said softly. He nodded. "This land remembers." They took shelter in one of the empty cabins that night. The roof was half collapsed, but it offered cover. The woman sat by the window, the satchel resting beside her. "If I die before we reach Tucson," she said quietly, "promise me you'll take the book yourself." The Apache turned toward her, his voice calm but firm. "You're not dying, not while I breathe." She gave a small, weary smile. "You talk like you've fought worse odds." "I have," he said. Later, as she drifted to sleep, he walked outside. The air was cool, filled with the faint hum of insects. He looked east, where the stars hung low over the desert. Somewhere out there, men were tracking them, their greed burning hotter than the sun. But something else troubled him now, the way she had looked at that empty town, the pain in her voice when she spoke of her past. He had seen that same look before, in those who had lost everything but refused to break. The night stretched long and quiet, but the peace was fragile. Far off in the darkness, a faint light flickered the glow of another fire, too distant to mistake. They weren't alone. The Apache turned back toward the cabin, his hand brushing the knife at his belt. Tomorrow would bring more than just a chase. Tomorrow would bring choices neither of them were ready to make. Inside, the woman stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't quite hear. The satchel lay beside her, the edges of the leather book just visible beneath the cloth. He stared at it for a long moment, wondering what secrets it carried, what blood had already been spilled for its pages. When he finally lay down, the first light of dawn was already touching the horizon. The land seemed calm again, but beneath that calm, danger was moving slow, steady, and unstoppable. And somewhere deep inside him, the Apache knew that the hardest part of their journey had yet to begin. The morning came quiet, but the kind of quiet that warned of trouble. The air was still, the light pale and uneasy. The Apache saddled his horse without a word while the woman packed what little they had left. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. He noticed, but didn't say anything. The silence between them had grown heavier with each mile, filled with the things they both feared to speak. They left the ghost town before sunrise, riding toward the east. The desert stretched out wide and lonely, the hills rising like old bones against the horizon. For hours they didn't stop. The Apache kept scanning the ridges and dry gullies, his instincts sharp. He could feel that their hunters were close. The woman rode behind him, her gaze fixed ahead, as if looking too far back might make her fall apart. Around midday they reached a ravine where the earth split open, jagged and deep. The Apache slowed his horse, dismounting to check the ground. Tracks. At least 6 riders had passed through not long ago. He crouched low, touching the prints. The marks were fresh, the edges sharp, his jaw tightened. "They've circled around," he said. "They're trying to cut us off." The woman's eyes darkened. "Can we still make Tucson?" "If we move fast," he replied, "but we'll have to cross the river valley. It's open ground. No cover." She hesitated, glancing toward the distant line of cottonwoods that marked the river. "Then we'll have to risk it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Once we reach the other side, you keep riding, no matter what happens. Don't stop for me." She shook her head, her voice firm. "Not leaving you." "You will," he said quietly. "You must." The words hung between them, heavy and certain. She didn't argue again. They rode on through the afternoon, the heat rising from the ground in shimmering waves. The Apache's eyes never stopped moving. Every shadow, every flicker of light could mean danger. By the time they reached the valley, the sun had started to fall, and the sky glowed with deep orange light. The air was thick with tension. They paused at the edge of the riverbank. The water was shallow but fast, churning against the rocks. The woman looked across it, toward the narrow path that led up the opposite slope. "Once we cross, how far to the mission?" "Half a day," he said. "If the horses hold." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Then let's not waste time." They guided the horses into the water. The current tugged at their legs, cold and strong. The Apache led the way, his eyes scanning the far bank. He could feel it now, the prickling sense of eyes watching from somewhere unseen. The sound of the river drowned out everything, making the silence behind them more dangerous. Halfway across, the first gunshot cracked through the air. The woman gasped as the bullet struck the water beside her, splashing up a spray. The Apache turned sharply, spotting movement among the rocks behind them. Figures on horseback, rifles glinting in the fading light. "Go," he shouted. "Keep going." She urged her horse forward, water splashing high around her. The Apache turned his own mount, drawing his bow in one swift motion. He loosed 2 arrows, each finding its mark. The attackers hesitated, startled by the sudden strike. It gave her enough time to reach the far side. She scrambled up the slope, her horse slipping on the wet rocks. The Apache followed, ducking low as another bullet whined past. The riders were closing in fast now, their shouts echoing across the canyon. He turned once more, releasing another arrow before galloping after her. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun had fallen below the horizon. The world turned to shades of gray and blue. The woman looked back, breathless. "They're still coming," she said. "I know," he replied. "They won't stop until they have what you carry." They rode on into the night, guided by the faint light of the moon. The land grew steeper, the trail narrow and treacherous. Rocks shifted beneath the horses' hooves. The woman gripped the reins tightly, every muscle tense. After an hour, they reached a stretch of high ground where the land opened into a small plateau. From there, they could see the lights of the town far in the distance, tiny flickers against the dark horizon. "Tucson," she whispered, her voice full of both hope and fear. The Apache didn't answer. His focus was behind them. In the darkness, he could see the faint glow of campfires. Their pursuers were closer than ever. He turned back to her. "We'll rest here for a few minutes," he said, "and we move again." She slid from her saddle, her legs unsteady. "I don't think I can keep this pace much longer," she admitted. "I haven't slept. I haven't eaten. My body's giving up." He crouched beside her, his tone calm but firm. "You'll hold on a little longer. You've come too far to fall now." She looked at him then, eyes full of doubt and exhaustion. "Why do you keep risking yourself for me? You don't even know who I am." He held her gaze, his voice low. "I know enough. You fight for something worth saving." She looked down, her fingers brushing the satchel that hung across her chest. "It doesn't feel worth it anymore," she said. "It feels cursed." The Apache's expression softened. Sometimes the truth is a curse, but running from it only gives it power. The sound of horses in the distance broke the quiet. The woman froze, her breath catching. "They found us," she whispered. The Apache stood, scanning the shadows below the ridge. He could see movement, now dark figures climbing the slope. "Too many. Can't outrun them this time," he said. "But we can make them pay for every step." He led the horses to a cluster of rocks, tying them out of sight. Then he turned to her. "Stay low. Don't move until I tell you." "What are you going to do?" she asked. He strung his bow, checking his arrows. "Give them a reason to fear the dark." The first riders reached the edge of the plateau not long after. They moved cautiously, their rifles ready. The Apache watched from behind the rocks, waiting. When the nearest man stepped into the open, he fired. The arrow struck clean through the shoulder. The man cried out and fell back. Chaos followed. Gunfire shattered the stillness. Bullets struck the rocks, sending sparks into the night. The Apache moved like a shadow, shifting from cover to cover. His calm precision made the attackers hesitate, uncertain how many they were facing. The woman pressed herself against the ground, clutching the satchel to her chest. Every sound made her flinch. She could hear the shouting, the clash of steel, the heavy thud of hooves. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body wouldn't move. Then a voice cut through the chaos, a voice she recognized. Cold, commanding. "Bring her alive. The book's no use if she's dead." Her blood ran cold. It was him, the man she'd seen the night her husband was killed. The one who had smiled while the flames took everything she loved. She crawled forward, peering over the rock. His face was the same, hard, calculating, untouched by remorse. The Apache saw him too. Their eyes met across the darkness. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was personal now. He drew another arrow, but before he could release it, a shot rang out. The bullet grazed his arm, spinning him back against the rock. Pain flared, but he forced himself to stay silent. The woman saw it happen and started forward, but he shook his head sharply. "Stay down," he hissed. The attackers were closing in. Shadows moved all around, circling like wolves. The Apache's arrows were running low, and the woman's fear was rising fast. She reached for the revolver he'd given her days ago, hands trembling. "Tell me what to do," she whispered. He met her eyes. "When I say ride, You ride. Don't stop. No matter what you hear. Her breath caught. You're not coming with me, are you? He didn't answer. His silence said enough. The men began climbing higher, their torches cutting through the dark. The Apache set one last arrow to his bow, his jaw tight. The woman's heart pounded so loud she thought they might hear it. When the first rider stepped into view, she saw the flash of metal, the glint of greed in his eyes. The Apache loosed his arrow. The man fell, his torch dropping into the dry grass below. Flames caught instantly, spreading fast through the brush. The firelight painted the night red and gold. Smoke rose, thick and choking. The attackers hesitated, some shouting orders, others retreating. The Apache turned to her now. She scrambled to her horse, her mind a blur. Behind her, the flames roared higher. She looked back once, just once, and saw him standing there, bow in hand, framed by fire and shadow. He didn't move to follow. Tears burned her eyes as she kicked her horse into motion. The wind tore at her face, the sound of gunfire fading behind her. Ahead lay only darkness and the faint promise of safety. But even as she rode, a part of her knew the fight wasn't over. The man she feared most was still out there, and the Apache, her only ally, was facing him alone. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the truth rising like a storm before dawn. One of them would not see the sun again. The woman rode through the darkness until her arms and legs ached, the sound of the burning ridge echoing faintly behind her. The horse stumbled once, catching its breath, but she urged it on. She didn't dare stop. Not yet. Her mind was full of the Apache's face in the firelight, the steady calm in his eyes as he turned back toward danger. Every part of her wanted to turn around, but his last words echoed over and over, keep riding, no matter what you hear. The night stretched long and endless. The desert air grew colder. The stars dimmed behind thin clouds. By the time the first light of morning broke across the horizon, her horse was trembling, and she was barely holding herself upright. Ahead, she saw the faint outline of a mission rising from the flat land, a small stone building surrounded by tall mesquite trees. Relief flooded her so fast, she almost cried. When she reached the gates, an old priest came out to meet her, startled by the sight of the dust-covered woman and the exhausted horse. He helped her down, his kind eyes full of concern. "You're safe here, my child," he said. "No one will harm you under this roof." But she wasn't listening. She kept looking back toward the distant hills, waiting for another figure to appear. Hours passed, and he didn't come. The priest gave her water, a place to rest, and warm bread, but she couldn't eat. Her thoughts were still out there in the smoke and the silence of the desert. When the sun was high, she finally asked for paper and ink. Her hands shook as she opened the satchel and pulled out the old book she had guarded for so long. Its leather cover was worn and cracked, the edges blackened from fire. Inside were the records her husband had written, the truth about the men who had destroyed their town. The deals they'd made and the lives they'd taken to build their empire. It was evidence that could bring them down, but it had already cost her everything. She ran her fingers across the pages, remembering the night her husband had hidden it in her hands. "If I don't make it," he had said, "promise me you'll keep this safe. Promise me the truth won't die with us." Now she finally understood why the Apache had chosen to help her. He hadn't done it for the book. He'd done it because he saw what it meant to fight for something that could save others, even when it couldn't save yourself. Later that afternoon, a young boy came running into the mission yard, his voice breathless. "Father, there's someone out by the river." She froze. The priest looked at her. "Maybe a traveler," he said softly, but she was already moving. She ran past the gate, her heart pounding with every step. Down the slope, by the edge of the shallow river, a man leaned against a fallen tree. His clothes were torn, his arm bandaged roughly with a strip of cloth. But when he lifted his head, she saw him. It was him. The Apache's face was pale, streaked with dust and blood, but his eyes still held that same steady light. She dropped to her knees beside him, tears spilling freely now. "You made it," she whispered. He gave a faint smile. "Did you think I'd let them win?" She laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "You're the hardest man to kill I've ever met." He didn't answer right away. He looked toward the horizon instead, where smoke still hung in the distance like a scar. "They're gone," he said quietly. "Most of them ran when the fire spread. The one who led them won't be coming after you again." Her expression changed. "Did you?" He stopped her with a look. "Some things are better left buried in the ashes. They sat there for a long time, listening to the soft rush of water. For the first time in weeks, the world around them felt still. When the priest came down later, with food and bandages, the Apache allowed himself to be helped inside the mission. His wounds were deep but not fatal, and the old man treated him carefully. Over the next few days, as he healed, they spoke little of what had happened. The woman stayed by his side, sometimes helping, sometimes just sitting quietly. She began to feel a strange peace, the kind that only comes when the worst has already passed. One evening, as the sun was setting, the priest came to them, carrying a sealed letter. "The authorities will be here soon," he told her. "You should give them what you have. It will mean justice." She nodded slowly, holding the satchel close. "Justice," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I used to think that would make everything right." The Apache looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "Justice doesn't fix what's gone," he said, "but it can stop it from happening again." She met his eyes, seeing the truth in them. For so long she had been running, hiding, surviving. She finally had a choice to live, not in fear, but in purpose. When the soldiers arrived the next morning, she handed over the book without hesitation. They promised protection and rewards, but she only asked for one thing, that the truth be made public, so no one else would suffer in silence. After they left, the mission felt empty again. The Apache prepared to go soon after, his arm still bandaged, but his spirit restless. She watched him saddle his horse, her heart heavy. "Where will you go now?" she asked. He adjusted the reins, glancing toward the far mountains. "Home," he said. "There are others who still need me." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You could stay. You'd be safe here." He smiled faintly. "Safety isn't what I'm looking for." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was warm, filled with the scent of dust and sage. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how deeply his courage had changed her, but the words felt too small. So instead, she just reached out and touched his arm. "Then go with peace," she said. He nodded, mounting his horse. "And you," he said quietly, "go live." She watched him ride away until he disappeared into the wide horizon. The wind carried the faint sound of his horse's hooves until it faded into silence. Days turned into weeks. The woman stayed at the mission, helping the priest tend to the sick and the travelers who passed through. News began to spread about the arrests, the trials, the hidden crimes finally brought to light. The names of the guilty men appeared in the newspapers. And for the first time in a long while, the weight she carried began to lift. At night, she would sometimes walk to the riverbank and stare out toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, she knew he was still riding, still fighting for something bigger than himself. And though they might never meet again, she carried his words with her, simple, strong, and unforgettable. Months later, when spring returned and the desert bloomed with wildflowers, a small package arrived at the mission addressed to her. Inside was a carved wooden charm, shaped like an eagle, and a single line written in steady hand. "The wind always remembers the brave." She held it close, smiling through tears. It wasn't goodbye. It was a promise that the paths they had crossed would never truly part. Years passed, and the world moved on. The mission grew busier, the town rebuilt, and life slowly found its rhythm again. But sometimes, when the sun set over the hills and the sky turned gold, those who passed the old mission would see a woman standing at the edge of the river, her hair stirred by the wind, her gaze fixed on the horizon. And though they didn't know her story, they could sense something in her quiet strength born from fire, loss, and survival. The tale of the widow and the Apache became a whisper among travelers, a story of courage and redemption carried on desert winds. Because some stories don't end with victory or defeat. They end with understanding, with the simple truth that even in a world built on pain, there can still be kindness, loyalty, and second chances. And as the last light faded across the valley, the woman finally smiled, not in sorrow, but in peace. The ghosts of the past no longer followed her. The future at last was hers to claim.